What's your worst creepy encounter? Welcome back to another video, everyone. My name is Em if you're new here, and without further ado, let's get into some of these scariest real-life stories to happen to people on Reddit. Story 1. Always check who's at the door. This experience happened to my roommates and I in our second year of university. The city we went to school in and was considered a very safe university town. The most we had heard of happening was drunk morons doing typical drunk moron things. This was also the first time we were all really living on our own. First year residences are nice, but it's basically an extended summer camp rather than a typical living situation. The 4 of us girls lived in a nice townhouse that never once had a creepy vibe or weird neighbors in the months we had lived there. The only eerie part was that every weekend we were the only people who stayed in the complex. All of our neighbors either went home or stayed elsewhere until returning Monday for classes. This was never something we had given a second thought to, considering that was fairly normal for a uni town, especially because our complex was only made up of about 4 other townhouses. The complex was surrounded by walking trails and farm fields, which we loved. It was like our quiet spot away from the chaos of college kids. There were a few farmhouses we could see from our backyard, but other than that, we were fairly secluded. The university was about a 20-minute bus ride away, which was never a big deal for any of us, especially because the rent was far cheaper here than in places that were within walking distance to campus. Being 5 foot 6 inches, I was the tallest by a considerable amount. I was also the only one out of the group who had been in a handful of scary situations. Due to this, I was the only one up to this point who would lock the doors, windows, and garage before leaving or going to bed. My roommates grew up in a small, very safe town, so it was uncommon for them to lock the doors back home. They were also incredibly kind and trusting to everyone, never considering hidden bad intentions. The night in question started very normally. We'd planned on having a wine and movie night. This was kind of like a weekly tradition for us. We would pick out some stupid movie, get takeout, and get a little buzzed after a long week of classes and work. At this point, it was early November, so we'd been doing this for several months with no issues. By 8:30ish, we'd all settled on the couch in our living room and had started a comedy. With it being November, it was already completely dark outside, other than our porch light we could see from a small window at the top of our door. None of us were tall enough to see anything out of that window anyway, so we relied entirely on our peephole. It took a great amount of effort for me to convince my roommates to check the peephole before opening the door. This was a talk we had after one roommate had opened the door for our neighbor's very drunk friend, who threw up all over our main floor. Not long after ordering our takeout, we heard banging on our front door. Jess made a joke about how the delivery guy must have taken a helicopter to get here this quickly, especially considering the place we ordered from was very close to campus. It was not a typical delivery guy's knock either, but between the few glasses of wine and carefree attitude of the night, we didn't really pay it too much mind. It was my roommate's turn to pay this week. I'll call her Meg for the sake of this story. Out of the group, she's the smallest, barely 5 feet, 0 inches. She is also the most trusting person I think I have ever met. She ran up to her room to grab her wallet. This took 30 seconds. During this time, the banging continued and was getting more aggressive. I figured maybe it was cold or he had other crap to do, so he yelled up to get her to hurry. The banging continued to get harder and harder, and I started to feel a bit uneasy. When she came back down, I told her to check the peephole before opening it, as she was usually the one to just open up. She got to the door and looked out the peephole. She could barely reach it on a good day, so when she said she couldn't see anything, my other roommate and I got up to help. My second roommate, I'll call her Jess, is a very funny person. There are very few things that she would not turn into a joke. Jess got to the door before I did and looked out of the peephole. The person on the other side is still banging away. When she turned to look at me, I knew something was wrong. She looked incredibly confused. A look I had rarely seen from her was very clever. Within a second, she had gone back in for another look. This time, her face was not confused. She looked afraid. This made my stomach upset. She's a horror movie fanatic and she doesn't scare easily. I think someone is covering the peephole, she whispered, shouted at us. This time I looked out at the peephole, seeing that, yep, something was covering the peephole. We could still see the porch light shining through the window at the top, so we knew it was not a case of it being too dark to be able to see what was going on. By now, our other roommate, whom I'll call Anne, had walked down the hall trying to find out what was going on, even though she was easily the drunkest out of the 4 of us. Even sober, though, she seemed to think she was invincible. "What is your problem? Open the door." "The poor dude has his hands full," was Anne's idea. Jess and I explained what was going on. At this point, Meg, Jess, and I all had a gut feeling something was wrong. This is when Jess asked Meg to check the website she had ordered her food on. Meg had not placed the order. Between the wine and the silliness of the earlier night, she'd selected our food but did not finish the last step. The banging continued as her situation started to sink in, and still did not seem to grasp what was happening and tried to unlock the door. "Stop," I snapped at her. Immediately I knew it was too loud. For the first time, the person on the other side of the door spoke. "This is the police. Open the door now. We have a few questions to ask you." A man's voice practically growled back at us. This sobered me up right away. I looked over at Meg, who was already welling up, then at Jess, who'd gone completely pale. At this point, Anne also realized something was not right and froze, which is the least Anne thing she could have done. The banging was getting increasingly harder, to the point we could physically see the door breathe with each end. Meg took Anne upstairs trying to calm each other down and check if there was a police car parked outside, and make sure our windows were locked, though it was hard to do. It was possible to get onto part of our roof that made it possible to get to Anne's window. We heard a window slam, immediately knowing that it had been Anne's window. Being a bit of a thrill seeker, and Anne had taken her window screen in order to sit on the roof. For some reason, this made what was happening very real. "Show me your badge, then we'll open the door," I yelled back. Instead of a response, it sounded like the guy started to kick the door. I told Jess to call the police and ask if they had an officer dispatched to her address. Jess was shaking so badly at this point that it was hard for her to dial. Now Megan's come back down the stairs, sharing that there was no police car parked outside, and trailed behind her, standing on the stair, trying to get a look outside the window at the top of the door. At that moment, my blood ran cold, remembering that the man at the door had said, "We're not high." Jess had just come to the same realization. She sprinted to the back door, a large sliding glass door which she double-checked was locked. Thankfully, it had been. She drew the curtains as well, trying to minimize the chance of them seeing it. Within a minute, the knocking started at her back door as well. Thank God she'd closed the curtains, because the idea of seeing whoever was doing that still gave me chills. "Uncover the peephole and show me your badge," I yelled again, trying to sound as intimidating as a young college girl could. We were met with silence, which was so much worse than the banging. "What is your badge number at least? Prove to us that you were the police," I screamed, trying to keep my voice from breaking. The only response I got back was a gravelly, "I can't do that." Jess had handed her phone off to Meg, who was sobbing now, trying to speak to the dispatcher. The banging, now coming from both sides of the house, must have been heard by the operator. "Is there someone trying to break in?" she asked Meg, obviously being unable to understand her. Meg frantically asked if the police had been sent to her house. The answer we all knew by now was no. Meg babbled that at least 2 men tried to get us to unlock the door by impersonating a police officer. "Try to stay calm, stay on the phone with me. Police are on their way to your address," the operator told Meg. "How long will they be?" Meg asked back. "No more than 10 minutes later," she responded. That made Meg cry harder, realizing just how long 10 minutes really is. The door was being hit so hard I worried it would break. Just ran back toward our back door, making me worried that our kitchen window had been open. Trying to think, I put a chair into the doorknob and sat down, hoping the door would hold. I just came back to the front door, holding a kitchen knife and a fire extinguisher, which were the only things we had to protect ourselves in case they got in. Anne was now sitting on the landing, flinching with each end. Anne was farmer tough and had no issue dealing with animals 3 times her size. What was happening now, though, was entirely different. We had nothing to really deter whoever wanted in. No prods and no backup until the real police showed up. Not like what she was used to. She grew up having family as her neighbors her whole life. If anything was happening, her uncles and grandfather were at her front door in a minute flat. Anne's invincible attitude was long gone. She was now as scared as the rest of us, only having some wood and glass keeping these men out. Each hit to the back door made me expect whoever was there to break through the glass, open the door, and the man yelled at us, not caring if we thought they were police anymore. Then it got very quiet again, which made me want to throw up. The only thing worse than what was happening was not knowing where the men were. The idea of both men moving to the back door made me absolutely terrified. If they really wanted to, it would take very little effort to smash through the plate glass. Instead, the knocking at the back door had completely ceased. Within seconds of that, the front door started being hit again, trying to wrap my mind around why they would leave the easiest entry and go to heavy wood. I realized the back door was visible to the main road, where they'd seen a car or heard us talking to the police. They were smart enough not to want to be seen by anyone. Just then, they said something I'd not thought of. "I don't think they want to rob us. There are so many houses that are empty. Why would they come to the only house with lights on?" My whole body went cold. I did not have an answer. All I could say was, "You're right." Meg clearly felt the same because at this point, she was practically hyperventilating. The 3 of us stayed quiet for a minute. Awful scenarios running through our heads. Moved back up the last few steps and made out of sight. The operator, who we had forgotten was on speaker, which practically made me jump out of my skin. She must have felt how terrified we were and tried to calm us down. The police are 2 minutes away. They have their sirens turned off and the lights are on. You should be able to see them very soon. Stay on the phone with me so I can confirm when they are outside for you, she said. The men outside were starting to seem desperate. The sound of glass shattering had me turn into the back door, fully expecting to go see a fence, but the door was still intact. Instead, our porch light, the only light illuminating our dark street, went out, which put 2 and 2 together for me. Understanding that they'd destroyed the only way we would have been able to identify whoever was on the other side. Freak you, a voice we hadn't heard before. Whoever was at the back door. This was worse than the initial speaker. It was so full of hate and venom that it scared me more than the banging. He was so calm, intent on whatever his goal was. It hadn't felt like how the first man had sounded. Up until this point, I could have convinced myself that they had wanted our valuables. But this voice made me understand that he had wanted us. To this day, I have never heard a voice come close to that level of malice. It sounded like he wanted to inflict serious harm on us. And if he had gained entry, I know he would have. Somehow, I wanted the first man to speak again instead of whichever sick B word had just spoken. I looked at Meg. I know how terrified I must have looked. Until now, I may have done a half-decent job at hiding how scared I was, but that voice ruined my ability to stay stone-faced. Meg looked like a scared little girl, and that made panic. If they got in, there's nothing I'd be able to do to stop them. Not for me and not for my friends. We would have been at the mercy of the monster outside. Jess had practically stopped breathing. It was like the oxygen had been sucked out of the air. It was so quiet. It sounded like a gunshot when our mailbox opened and ran back down the stairs. I see the sirens. They're coming down the main road now, she whispered, hoping not to have the men hear. The same man spoke again, one more time, so slowly that I almost thought he was done after each word. In that same, awful, calm voice, he read out a letter addressed to the 4 of us. Our neighbors must have put it in the mail today. She'd planned a potluck for the next week. None of us thought to check the mailbox after we had talked to her in the driveway this morning. Jess, Meg, Ann, OP. Those are nice names. I'll be back soon, girls. Then we'll have some fun. I felt tears rolling down my face. I hadn't realized I had started crying, but I knew he meant what he had said. I tried to pull my mind out of the dark pit that sentence had said it to. Waiting, praying that the police had surprised them, hoping they would not get the chance to come back. The silence continued. None of us dared to speak, worried that we would not hear if they moved to another point of entry. Instead, the silence persisted for what felt like a lifetime. The operator was the first one to speak again, telling us that the police are out front. She told us to stay in the house until the police knocked on the door. The young woman stayed on the phone with us for several more minutes while the police searched around the area. Finally, the real police showed their badge to the people before even knocking to try not to scare us. The operator told us that we had done well and that we're in good hands now. We opened the door to be met by 2 kind-looking older police officers who we let in. Glass shards covered our front stoop from our porch light. It looked like it had been ripped out of the wall and smashed into the concrete below. There were several police cars out front of our previously quiet home. The headlights on all of the cars were shining down the street towards the walking trail. We spoke to the officers who took a report from us. They asked us to describe the night's events. In detail, they asked us if we saw them at all, and we explained how the people had been covered and the light had been smashed before moving away from the door. The officers advised us to speak to our landlord about, at the very least, security cameras. The older officer then closed the pad he had been writing in and looked up at us. He then spoke a phrase that made me understand how much danger we had been in. Look, if any of you were my daughters, I would have wanted the officer to tell her, if you can get out of your lease, do it. They know where you all live, and they also know the response time for us, especially after telling you all that he would be back. After that, they asked if we had heard a vehicle. That was something I'd not considered. We did not hear any type of motor until the police were there. Even when Meg and Ann had wanted to look for a police car, they saw no cars on the street at all. So likely that meant they had come from the walking path, which would explain how they left without passing the police on their way back to the main road. The older officer of the 2 had a look that told me he had an idea of what was going on. He looked sad, which was worse than if he had looked scared. I knew he had seen the situation and far worse in the past. We pushed for an explanation, but were only told that this had been 2 years ago, but did not elaborate past that point. The officer stood up, exchanged a glance that I did not know how to read, and then spoke again. We will have a cruiser parked in the driveway as well as a plain car around the back. They will not have a chance to try again. They did not catch the men in the 2 more weeks we lived there. We had a few creepy things, but nothing close to this. The reality was that they had not been caught, and they could come back anytime. After this night, we spoke to our landlady, who was incredible. She owned several properties around the city, and when we explained what had happened, she let us move to an apartment closer to campus. She told us that our safety is more important than making a few $100s. She even left the house empty for many months in order to make sure cameras, better locks, and a reinforced back door were put in. Thankfully, they did not come back, and we were able to enjoy our new apartment without worrying. This is still so scary to me because of that voice. Make sure you lock your doors and check who's there before opening the door. Wow, OP, I was legit on the edge of my seat while reading this story, just trying to guess what was gonna happen next. If the dude was gonna break in or not. Seriously though, you legitimately saved all of your friends' lives that night, and I really hope they bought you dinner or something. I would also say that out of my 3 roommates, I'm the one who's the most cautious, and I can honestly feel it more when they go out and talk about bringing random guys back to the apartment. So I do feel your frustration. At least your friends listened to you and realized what was going on before you would open the door and things went haywire. Story 2. Last people to see man alive. Summer of 2002, my girlfriend called me hysterical. There's a white truck that's been following me for about 10 minutes. Ever since I left Walmart, it's been right behind me. I've driven all over and even gone in circles. I think it's the killer. At that time in Baton Rouge, a serial killer had been enlarged for a while. The FBI had said beyond that lookout for a while, man driving a large pickup truck. A lot of his victims were brunettes that trended towards wealthier neighborhoods. My girlfriend at the time was brunette, but wasn't wealthy. But this week she was house-sitting for her aunt, who was a literal millionaire, and was driving her aunt's Lexus. Okay, I say, we're on our way. Her aunt lived in a huge house on the LSU lakes. I don't think much of it. It's LSU and stupid stuff happens all the time. This is a prank of some kind, I'm sure of it. A few minutes later and we're at the interstate exit. I call her to say where we are before she picks up. I see her aunt's car pass by a white truck right behind. Go to the house. We're right behind them. She pulls into her aunt's driveway, but the car stops and pulls over immediately when she does. We pull in right behind her and she's very upset. Recounts everything she said on the phone and I are sure it'll be okay. My roommate gives me an assuring nod. I'm gonna hide in the shadows. If he tries anything, lead him this way and I'll hit him. I make myself seen to the truck's cab and approach slowly with my hands visible. There's an African-American man in the cab, not a white guy. This is not the killer we're worried about. Hey man, I announce, and he won't look directly at me. He's just looking at me sideways. I think there's a mix-up or something. You've been following my girlfriend for a while here. You're freaking her out and you're gonna have to go. Finally, turn on the truck and turn to give me a look. He's bothered or pissed off and he drives off. And I will not see his face again until next year, when he's on the cover of the local paper, The Advocate, and he's been arrested for multiple murders. I ran into Derek Lee. Story 3. Whistling in the Woods. In July 2015, I went on a hike with my husband and 2 friends. We also had our dog with us. We live in Western Washington, and that time of year, it stays lightish until 9 to 10 p.m. It was about 7:30 as we headed up. The trail peaks at a beautiful lake with a loop trail that brings you back to the original trail I ordered to descend, light or not. It was late enough in the evening that many people passed us on their way down. As we headed up, you can see the entirety of the lake from the top of the trail, and we were clearly the last people up there. As we made our way back down, it was starting to get dark. Strangely, we crossed paths with a man making his way up towards the lake. He was not dressed in a way that would suggest he was camping or even hiking. He had regular sneakers, a t-shirt, and shorts. No water, no pack. Nothing. We tried to make conversation, but he would not speak or make eye contact. My dog caught wind and stiffed his feet and wanted to run back to him. I had to call her off several times. The whole interaction seemed so odd. We could not shake the feeling that he was incredibly out of place. About 25 minutes later, we heard a single gunshot. He'd killed himself. At the parking lot to the trail, there was one remaining car. We assumed it must have been his. It was unlocked and there was an envelope on the driver's seat. Both observed through the window. Didn't open the door. We notified the ranger that stayed in a cabin at the edge of the parking lot, who said he'd call the police, but he wasn't risking running into a cougar to go up and check on the guy. He's not the first and he won't be the last, were his exact words. I wish I would have thought to ask, are you okay? Or anything at all. OP. Do not blame yourself for not checking in with the dude. It's a horrible thing to say, but your safety comes first and you were getting a weird vibe from this guy. So I don't think anyone blames you for not trying to help him. I honestly thought at first that this was just some dude who was going for a smoke somewhere pretty. Then I was thinking maybe it was something a little more legal. That being said, you truly could not have known what he was going to do. So don't make yourself feel bad for not stopping him. Story 4. My daughter was being stuck at a small amusement park by a couple. My daughter was about 8 or 9 at the time. We'll call her D for daughter. My mom loved taking her to this local amusement park where we live, and it had rides, rock climbing walls, etc. On this particular day, she was climbing all the walls. She'd hit the bell on the first try at the top, climb down, and go to a more difficult section. That's when my mom noticed them, a couple in their 30s or 40s whispering to each other and looking at Dee. So my mom told Dee they were going somewhere different and moved to another section of the park. Not more than 5 minutes later, there they were again, staring at Dee and whispering to each other. They left again, only to see the couple again getting closer to Dee. At that point, my mom was becoming paranoid and decided to leave. That's when they approached them both. They were trying to talk to Dee. Luckily, my mom has an instinct with creepy people and snagged Dee and put her behind her. And this is what she told them. "What business do you have talking to an 8-year-old? You weird-ass perverts. You didn't think I'd seen you following us all around the park, staring at my granddaughter and whispering to each other? I'm calling the police." At that point, they left in an absolute hurry. Didn't even give an explanation. Thanks, Mom. Who knows what their intentions were, but I'm glad we never got to find out. Glad to have such an observant mom in this situation. And she did report it and gave descriptions of the people, just in case the kid went missing.
Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.